They say the mountains don't speak, but they remember. Every footstep, every scream, every broken promise buried beneath snow and pine. That morning, I wasn't looking for ghosts. I was tracking a buck. But when I found her, beaten, bound, and barely breathing, I knew. The hunt was over, and the reckoning had begun. The December wind carved through the Sacramento range like a knife through sinew. I'd been out 2 days, following a buck's trail through knee-deep drifts. My fingers were stiff around the stock of my Winchester, and the silence, that brutal white silence, screamed louder than any rifle ever could. That's when the trail changed. Not hoofprints now, blood. Bright, wet droplets blooming on the snow like red petals. Too fresh, too human. My gut clenched before my mind could catch up. I moved slow, quiet. The forest had a way of hiding things men weren't meant to find. Then I saw her. Face down in the frozen creek, wrists tied behind her back with rawhide leather that had chewed into the bone. Her black hair was caked with ice and blood. Her buckskin dress was torn, barely clinging to her. Whoever did this left her for the coyotes, and part of me, a tired, scarred part, almost turned around. I'd buried Clara May and our little girl Beth 3 winters back. Swore I was done with blood. Swore it to the pine and the snow and the God who hadn't answered me in years. But then, her eyes opened, black as coal, fierce as wildfire, and defiant, even while dying. In that one look, I saw something I hadn't seen in a long damn time, a reason to fight. I cut the bindings, careful and slow. She didn't flinch, just watched me like a cornered animal, her jaw locked in stubborn silence. I wrapped my wool coat around her shoulders, muttered, "Easy, now." She tried to stand. Legs buckled. I caught her. Her skin was burning up. Her dress bore the faint fading patterns of the Mescalero Apache, and her wrists told a longer story. Old scars, round and white, where chains had once bit deep. Not her first time being taken. Maybe 25, 26. Strong shoulders. Calloused hands, a survivor. A woman forged, not adorned. She whispered something, a name maybe. Taza. Then her eyes rolled back and she collapsed. I carried her 3 damn miles up the mountain, lungs burning, legs shaking, back to the cabin I'd built with silence in mind. The kind of silence only a man with too many ghosts could call home. That night, I cleaned her wounds by the light of a hissing oil lamp, used whiskey and creek water, bandaged her ribs, ripped up one of Clara's old shirts for the gash on her thigh, all while the wind howled like judgment through the pines. She burned, with fever for 2 days, didn't speak, didn't move, but she didn't die either. On the 3rd morning, I was outside splitting logs when I heard the door creak. I grabbed my Colt, stormed inside, ready for anything. She stood in the far corner, my coat still around her, eyes locked on me like she could see through to the bone. "Easy," I said, lowering the gun. "Ain't gonna hurt you." She didn't believe me, didn't need to say it. I could see it in the way her shoulders squared like a soldier, so I placed the Colt on the table, stepped back and opened the door. "There's food, water too, I'll be outside." For the next few days we danced that uneasy dance. Me stoking the fire and leaving food. Her watching from behind those coal-black eyes. Always wary, always quiet, like she was waiting for me to turn into one of the men who'd left her in that creek. But she ate, drank, healed, and on the 8th day, she stood on her own, leaning against the log wall, chin held high. "What you want?" she asked, voice rough, accent thick. I looked her in the eye. "Nothing, you were hurt. I helped." Her lip curled slightly. "White men kill my people." I didn't argue. I'd worn the blue once. Rode with the cavalry. Did things I can't forget no matter how hard I try. "I was a soldier," I said. "Ain't one now." "Why?" I stared at the fire. "Because I got tired of death." She didn't speak again, just looked at me for a long time. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel alone. To be continued. If this story gripped your heart like a vice, don't miss what comes next. Subscribe now to follow Wyatt and Neil's journey through fire, blood, and redemption. You won't believe what Part 2 brings. There's a kind of silence in these mountains that gets into your bones. Not peace, not quiet. No, a silence that watches you, weighs you, waiting to see who you really are when there's no one else to impress or lie to. That's the silence that filled my cabin the morning after Neil stood and spoke for the first time. She barely touched the stew I'd left on the wood stove, though she didn't take her eyes off me once. Sharp, guarded, like a bobcat testing whether I was friend, foe, or fool. I didn't push her, didn't ask questions. Just sat by the window, whittling a new handle for my old skinning knife, the fire crackling low beside us. Every so often her gaze would flick toward the Colt I kept holstered at my hip. I caught it every time. Didn't blame her. Trust don't come quick when a man's color matches the ones who whipped and burned and chained your people. She was, coiled tight, vigilant like a wild thing pulled from a trap but not yet sure if the hand that freed it means well or just wants another kind of collar. Late that afternoon, I was mending a busted boot heel when I heard her behind me. "You still soldier?" Her voice was dry as the high desert, caught me off guard. I looked over my shoulder. She stood near the door, blanket wrapped tight, face hard. "No," I said, setting down the boot. "Ain't been one in a long time." She took a step forward. Her bare feet whispered across the plank floor. "But you were." I nodded. "Fought Apaches. Rode under a man named Briggs out of Fort Bascom. Thought we were doing right. Then I came home and found my wife and daughter, both cold in their bed. Fever got 'em while I was out protecting folks. That was the day I quit being useful to anybody." She looked at me a long beat, then sat, slow, deliberate, like a queen claiming her throne, across the fire from me. We didn't speak, for a while. Just listened to the pine boughs groan in the wind outside. Finally, she spoke. "My name is Neil." I repeated it softly. "Neil." She gave the smallest nod. "Means wind." "Fitting," I said, half smiling. "You came, in like one. Cold, fierce, and unexpected." That earned the first flicker of something human in her eyes. Not quite a smile, but something close. From that day the silence changed shape, still heavy but no longer hostile. We began trading words, English and Apache. Simple things, food, fire, safe. Sometimes she'd correct my pronunciation with a slight shake of her head or a sharp tap on the table. Other times she would drift into her own tongue, a language that rolled like river stones and burned like mesquite smoke. I didn't know the words, but I understood the fifth night as I readied the fire for sleep. She sat near the hearth and began to hum. A low, trembling sound, half song, half prayer. It cut right through me. I didn't turn, just listened. When she stopped, she said, "That was for Taza, your son," I said. She nodded. "4 winters. He waits." That's when I understood. This wasn't just a woman I'd pulled from the creek. This was a mother clawing her way back to what mattered. Everything she'd endured, the beatings, the blood, the ice, it was for him. And in her voice, in that song, I heard the same ache that had been sitting in my chest since the day I buried my own. "I'll help you," I said. "Get back to him." She looked at me like I'd just offered her the moon. "You would die for me?" she asked. "No," I said, "but I'd sure as hell kill for you." Her head dropped. I heard her exhale slow, like some weight had eased off her ribs. That night she didn't lock the door to the back room where she slept. Didn't mean she trusted me, but it meant she was starting to believe, and that was enough. There's a certain kind of quiet that only comes after 2 people stop pretending they're strangers. It don't happen all at once. Not with folks like us, bruised by loss, bone-weary from the long haul of survival. But little by little, something started to shift in the air between us. Not trust exactly, not yet, but understanding. like two wolves caught in the same trap, learning to chew through it together. It was snowing again, lazy flakes drifting down like ash from a dying fire. Neil was seated near the stove, patching a tear in her old buckskin dress with sinew thread and a needle I'd fetched from the saddlebag. Her fingers moved with the kind of precision that comes from years of doing without. She didn't look up when she spoke. "Why did you help me?" That was the first real question she'd asked since telling me her name. I didn't answer right away, just leaned back in the chair, boots resting near the coals, chewing on the end of a matchstick. "Because I know what it's like to lose everything," I finally said. "And I'm tired of being the kind of man who walks past suffering like, it ain't his business." She tied off the thread, then looked at me. Those eyes, dark as a storm-split sky, didn't blink. "I was running to something," she said. "Not from it." I raised an eyebrow. "Your son?" "Taza," she nodded. 4 winters old. Last I saw him, he was curled against my sister's chest, holding his little drum. "He don't know I'm alive. You're gonna see him again," I said. A long silence hung between us, then she pointed to the scar on my jaw. "Apache?" she asked. I nodded. "Mescalero Lance, 1873. I lived. He didn't." Neil stood slowly and stepped closer. "Not all my people are innocent, but that does not make your pain less real." She reached out, her fingers brushing the edge of the scar, gentle, like she was touching a page in a story she didn't yet understand. "You carry that wound on the outside," she murmured, "but you got others deeper." "Same goes for you," I said. She stepped back, turned her left wrist palm up. A ring of old scar tissue stared back at me. Round, raised, ugly. "Chains," she said, like it was just another fact. My stomach turned. I'd seen cuffs like that. Hell, I'd delivered prisoners once wearing those same marks. Didn't seem like justice back then. Sure as hell didn't now. "I ain't proud of what I was," I said. "But I'd be damned if I don't try to. Be better now." She folded her arms, the fire casting her in copper and shadow. Words are wind. So are promises. Until they're kept. That stopped her cold. "Then let me make one," I said, rising slow, crossing the room so there wasn't a fire or rifle between us anymore. "You want to get to your boy? I'll get you there." Her brow furrowed. "You'd ride with me into Apache territory, with a bounty on my head and men who'd flay you alive for helping me." I didn't blink. "Yes." "Why?" "Because I already lost my daughter. I ain't gonna stand by and watch another child grow up without his mother." She studied me hard. Then for the first time she smiled. Small, wounded, real. "You're a strange man, Wyatt Cole. Strange is the only thing keeping me alive these days." She nodded once. "Then we ride. When the storm breaks." It was decided, just like that. Not with fanfare, not with long speeches. Just 2 people battered by the world deciding they wouldn't let it win this time. Later that night, I heard her humming again. A lullaby, softer than before. And for the first time, I didn't feel like a man hiding in the mountains. I felt like I had somewhere to go. The wind howled through, the pines like something wounded. Snow still drifted, but the edge was softening. I knew that meant 2 things: the pass would open, and the world outside would come sniffing again. We had maybe a day, 2 if we were lucky. And I'd learned a long time ago that luck wasn't something a man ought to count on. We needed supplies, ammunition, another rifle, maybe a damn miracle. "I'll ride to Lincoln," I said over coffee that morning. Neil looked up from the fire, steam curling from the tin cup in her hands. "Is it safe?" I gave a half laugh. Not even a little. She didn't smile, just nodded. "Don't be long." Her words were simple, but something in the way she said them, like she wasn't just worried I wouldn't come back, she was afraid I wouldn't want to. I saddled up the bay mare before the sun cleared the ridge. Dusty, the old Appaloosa I kept for pack work, watched me go with one eye, too stubborn, to rise in the snow. Lincoln lay 4 hours west, tucked in a fold of red rock and hard men, A place that smelled like gun oil, old sweat, and wood smoke soaked in whiskey. When I pushed through the batwing doors of the Lucky Chance Saloon, the stench of rot gut and lies hit me square. I'd been here before, years back. Not much had changed. Same crooked piano, same girls upstairs, same kind of men nursing regrets in dark corners. I ordered a whiskey I didn't want and leaned against the rail, listening. That's when I heard it. 2 men at a table in the back, talking low over a bottle of rye, 200 cash. Alive, preferably. Apache woman, early 20s, scar on the left wrist, runs with the Mescalero band. I didn't breathe, didn't blink. My jaw locked like a trap ready to spring. One of them leaned in. Said her name's Niall. Claims she knows where the last of the holdouts are hiding. Thorne wants her bad. Thorne. That name hit me like a nail in the spine. Silas Thorne, ex-cavalry. Now he hunted people the way others hunted game. Women, children, old men, didn't matter. If the price was right, Silas would bring them in or bleed them out. He wasn't a man. He was a sickness in human skin. Where's Thorne now? The other asked. Headed back east, Sacramento range. He's got 5 riders with him, maybe more. Says he'll comb every inch till he finds her. I set the glass down, untouched, walked out slow, steady. I didn't run, but my heart did. By the time I hit the saddle, the fear had hardened into something meaner. Not panic, not dread, resolve. I rode hard, chasing the sunset back to the cabin. When I got there, the light inside glowed warm through the shutters. I paused before stepping in just for a second to remember what it felt like to come home to. By the 12th morning, the thaw had begun. Not outside. The mountains were still wrapped in winter's iron grip. But between us. She no longer flinched when I came near. Her voice had found its edge again, and though she still didn't smile, I could tell when something amused her by the faintest flicker in her eyes. But peace don't last long in a world like this. That day, I saddled up early. Supplies were running low, flour, shot, salt. If we were gonna ride east toward her boy, we'd need more than trust and good intentions. I'm going to Lincoln, I told her, buckling the rifle scabbard to my saddle. Won't be long. You'll be safe here. She didn't argue, just handed me a folded scrap of buckskin with a small list written in charcoal. Beans, tallow, more thread, survival scrawled in a woman's hand. Her eyes met mine before I left. No fear. Just a kind of quiet calculation, like she knew something was coming. Lincoln was 2 days' ride down frozen trails and hard ruts, tucked in the shadow of the mountains like a mutt trying not to get kicked. The kind of town that smelled like horses and desperation, where men talked too loud and drank to forget. I hitched Dusty outside the saloon and pushed through the bat wings, the stink of tobacco and wet wool hitting me like a slap. The place was half full, ranch hands, drifters, a card dealer with one eye and no patience. I ordered coffee instead of whiskey. That's when I heard the name. From a table near the back, 2 cowhands leaned in over their drinks. Silas Thorne's. Paying 200 cold for that Apache woman, one muttered. My spine went stiff. She got away from his camp near Carrizozo. Claims she knows where the Mescalero band's hiding. Thorne wants her back alive or in pieces. I clenched my tin mug so hard the rim bent. Heat rushed to my ears. Where's Thorne now? The second man asked. Sacramento range, riding with 4, maybe 5 others. Bastard's got blood on his boots and ice in his chest. I didn't wait to hear more. Left the coffee steaming and shoved through the door like a man walking out of his own grave. The air hit cold and cruel, the kind that don't care if your lungs are burning or your heart's about to split. I rode hard, pushing Dusty through the snow without mercy. My mind raced ahead of me, painting every horror it could. I'd left her alone. She was out there with nothing but a knife and a half-healed soul, and now a price on her head. Thorne. That name clawed through the past. I knew him. We all did. Former cavalry. Hung up the uniform and traded it for something meaner. Trafficker, torturer. No man hunted women unless he thought they belonged to him, and Niall had escaped him. I reached the cabin well after dark. The light was still burning. Inside, smoke curled from the chimney like a prayer. I stepped through the door slow, breath tight. She was there, kneeling near the hearth, skin dappled in firelight, a rabbit roasting on the spit. She didn't look up right away. I watched her a moment, the way her hands moved, the way her shoulders held themselves now, not like prey, but like someone who remembered what it was to fight. When she finally turned, her eyes met mine and held. "He's coming," I said. She nodded once. "I know. You..." "No, Silas Thorne," her jaw set. "He's the man who chained me, who beat my sister. He don't forget what he thinks he owns." I stepped closer. The heat from the fire couldn't touch the cold in my chest. "He's got 5 men riding with him. One of them might be Reno. Used to ride with me back in '74. But he's gone. Rotten now. Men like Thorne turn loyalty into poison." She stared into the flames. "What are you gonna do?" she asked. I drew my knife, set it on the table beside the rifle. "What I swore I'd do," I said. "If he comes for you, he dies." She didn't flinch, just reached for her own blade, tested the edge with a thumb. "Then we prepare." We ate in silence, the rabbit crisped and smoky. She had seasoned it with wild thyme and desert sage. Survival tasted like fire and earth. After I moved through the cabin, loading bullets, checking saddles, sharpening steel. She watched. "I won't." "Run," she said. "Not again. I wouldn't ask you to." That night I lay awake with my rifle beside me, the sound of the wind groaning through the pines. I knew they'd come. Maybe tomorrow, maybe 2 days. But they'd come, and when they did, they'd find more than a bounty. They'd find 2 people with nothing left to lose. The fire burned low, throwing long shadows on the log walls, but neither of us moved to add more wood. Outside, the wind keened through the pines, like a coyote crying to something it couldn't catch. Inside, the air was heavy with what hadn't been said yet, with what was coming. I could feel it in my bones. The way the sky tightens before lightning splits it. Neol sat by the flames, legs tucked beneath her, knife in hand, sharpening the edge with the rhythm of a woman who didn't fear the blade. Only, what might come after? "You still sure about this?" I asked, my voice low, dry. She didn't look up. "You already asked. I'll keep asking till I believe you mean it." She paused, looked at me across the fire. Her voice didn't waver. "I meant it the first time." That shut me up. We were both wired tight, coiled like rawhide stretched to breaking. But neither of us backed down. There was no room for lies anymore. Not here. Not with death riding close behind. I rose, stripped off my coat. Beneath it, the scar from that old Apache lance glinted in the firelight. Jagged, white, mean. She stared, then stood. Her fingers reached out, slow, like touching something sacred. They traced the line across my jaw, down my throat. Her hand lingered over my chest. "You carry war like it never ended," she said. "Feels that way most days." She turned her back and loosened the tie of her deerskin dress. Let it fall to her hips. There were more scars, thin, roped, puckered, some old, some newer than I could stomach. Her skin was a map of survival, a testament to what no one had managed to break. She faced me again, eyes steady. "My husband died 2 winters ago. Fort Stanton. Bullet. No warning. No reason." She stepped closer. "I was taken after. I killed the first man who tried to touch me. The second nearly killed me. Thorne was the third." My breath caught. She wasn't crying, not begging. She was remembering, like a warrior cataloging the dead. Her voice was flat, but her eyes burned. "You're not him," she said. I swallowed hard. "I'm not." Her hands were on my shoulders now, rough palms meeting calloused skin. Her touch wasn't soft. It wasn't tender. It was something deeper, a claiming. Not possession, not desperation, but need. A raw human need to be seen, to be touched without fear. "You don't have to." "I want to," she said, cutting me off. There was no more talk after that. We didn't make love like the poets write about. We collided like two storms meeting over dry earth, feral, breathless, burning. Her mouth found mine, and I felt her tremble. Not from fear, but from the weight of choosing this moment, this man, this night. We moved together like fighters, scars, pressed to scars, pain meeting pain, trying to carve out something that looked like life before the darkness swallowed us. When it was done, we lay tangled in blankets, breath mingling in the cold air, her head on my chest, my arm around her waist. The silence wasn't empty now. It was full, heavy with meaning. She whispered something in Apache I didn't understand. "What's that? Mean?" I asked. "I remember your soul." She looked up at me. "Not your face, not your voice, your soul. That's what survives." I kissed her forehead, pulled her close. Neither of us slept much that night. The kind of peace we found was the kind you don't dare close your eyes on, for fear it might vanish when morning comes. At first light, I was already packing. 2 horses, 5 days of food, shot and powder, extra blankets, rope, always rope. She moved beside me like she'd always belonged there, quiet, focused, resolute. No more flinching, no more shadows in her eyes, just fire. "I know a path east," she said, cinching her saddle tight. "Old trading trail, hard to follow. Thorn won't know it." "Good," I said. "He won't need to know it. He won't catch us, and if he does," I met her gaze, "then he dies." She didn't smile, didn't nod, just mounted her horse like a warrior going home. As we rode out, the cabin faded behind us, just a dot in the pines, another ghost in the snow. We didn't speak much. We didn't need to, but I felt it, every step Dusty took beneath me. Something new had been forged between us, not love, not yet, but something stronger. 2 broken souls, tempered by loss, sharpened by trust. And somewhere out there a boy was waiting, and I'd ride through hell before I let her reach him alone. The snow fell light that morning, soft as dust, but the air carried weight. We broke camp before first light, the world still wrapped in darkness and frost. Neil rode ahead, her silhouette quiet and upright in the saddle. Dusty followed behind, his breath puffing in clouds, hooves crunching the hard-packed snow. We didn't talk much. Some words don't need repeating once they've been carved in fire and flesh. But I watched her as we rode, the way she scanned the horizon, the way her shoulders moved with the rhythm of the trail, steady and sure. She wasn't the same woman I'd pulled from the creek weeks ago. That woman had been hunted, broken, half dead. This one was carved from iron and loss, and she had purpose now. We were a day's ride from the Rio Hondo, headed east toward the Mescalero lands. Niall believed her son was still there, with kin if they hadn't been scattered or worse, and I'd made a vow to see her through, even if it killed me. Around noon I spotted the tracks. 5 sets of shod horses moving hard, cutting across the ridge like a blade. I dismounted, knelt in the snow, ran my fingers through the impressions. Deep, fresh, riding fast. "They're flanking us," I said. Niall crouched beside me, her face unreadable. "Thorn," she muttered. "They'll try to trap us in the ravine ahead." I nodded. The path we were following narrowed just past Devil's Elbow, a craggy outcrop that funneled riders into a choke point. "They're smart," I said, "but not smarter than 2 people with nothing left to lose." She gave a faint smile. Not soft, resigned. We mounted and turned east, veering off the main trail into the trees. Niall knew a side route, rough and winding, but it'd give us high ground if they came close. That evening we camped beneath a rock shelf near Eagle Pass. I'd never liked that stretch. Too many shadows, too much wind. The kind of place where bullets whispered before they screamed. We shared jerky and beans by a low fire, keeping it small to stay hidden. Niall sat sharpening her knife again, like she was preparing for something she knew was coming. I cleaned the Spencer rifle with trembling fingers. Nerves, yes, but something more. "This ain't gonna be just a chase," I said. "It's a test. They want to bleed us slow." She nodded, her eyes reflecting the flames. "He wants to break you. Make you choose between me and your life. I already made that choice. A long pause. Then quietly, "You'd die for me?" I looked at her for a beat. Shook my head. "No. I'll live for you. That's harder." She said nothing for a long time after that. But when we lay down, her hand found mine under the blanket. A silent tether. A line drawn in the dark. The next morning, I woke to silence. Too much of it. No birds. No wind. Just stillness. Then I heard it, a distant snort. Horse. Close. I motioned to Niol. She was already up, already alert, blade in one hand, rifle in the other. We climbed the ridge above the camp, crawling through pine and shale. And there they were, 5 riders moving fast through the clearing we'd passed the night before. Thorn wasn't with them, but I recognized one of the men, Reno. Used to ride together, back before he sold his soul for a coin purse and a bottle. "Wyatt," he shouted into the trees. "We know you got her." Niol tensed beside me. I could feel the fire in her through the snow. "You hear that?" I whispered. "They're desperate. That's our edge." She nodded once. "We strike first," she said. We moved like shadows, flanking them as they dismounted to check the snow. When the first shot rang out, it wasn't theirs. It was mine. Reno dropped like a sack of flower blood blooming in the snow. Then all hell broke loose. Gunfire exploded through the trees. One of their horses screamed and bolted. Niol fired twice, clean, calm, deadly. Another man fell, didn't get back up. I took one through the sleeve, grazed me clean, but it was enough to knock me sideways behind a stump. I shouted to Niol, "I'm hit, shoulder." She didn't pause. Laid down cover fire, eyes burning like coal, expression hard as flint. They retreated, dragging a wounded man behind them, left 2 bodies in the snow. We didn't chase. We didn't need to. This wasn't the war. This was the warning. That night, Niol cleaned the wound in my shoulder with spring water and old cloth. Her touch was rough but not unkind. "You were lucky," she said. "Luck's all I've ever had," I muttered. She tied the bandage tight, then looked at me. "He'll come himself next time." "I know." "And you'll kill him?" I held her gaze. "No, we will." The wind cut sharp that morning, slicing down the ridgeline like a knife through rawhide. Wyatt Cole spotted the hoofprints before the sun climbed over the aspens. 5 of them, deep and deliberate, coming in fast from the west. He didn't say a word, just tightened the cinch on his saddle, checked the load on his colt, and looked at Niol. She saw it in his face before he even spoke. Trouble was coming. They pushed hard through the timberline, weaving between patches of frost-hardened brush, snow crunching beneath hooves. The silence between them was no longer cold. It was focused. Niol rode like the land itself taught her, quiet and watchful, her rifle across her lap like a promise waiting to be kept. They didn't make it far. The ambush hit just past Dead Men's Gulch. The canyon walls narrowed, the light thinned, and the world erupted in gunfire. A bullet cracked, past Wyatt's cheek, kissing bark and drawing blood from his temple. He ducked instinctively, spurring Dusty into a side gallop as Niol wheeled her horse around with wild precision. 2 riders came in from the ridge, spitting lead like locusts. Another pair broke from the tree line. One of them, tall and scar-faced, let out a yell Wyatt hadn't heard in over a decade. "Reno," he muttered, eyes narrowing. "Goddamn Reno." The man had once worn the same blue uniform Wyatt had. Same war, different reasons. Now he rode with Silas Thorne's brand, and that made him no brother of Wyatt's. The fight turned brutal fast. Wyatt wheeled his carbine and fired once, straight through the chest of a rider too slow to duck. He caught another slug in the shoulder for it, spun halfway out the saddle, but stayed upright. Blood soaked his coat, warm against the bitter air. Niol dismounted before her horse even stopped. She dropped behind a felled pine and laid fire with her rifle, each shot as measured and cold as winter. A man screamed. Another fell silent forever. Reno dismounted and came in close, gun raised. Wyatt's vision swam, pain clouding his edge. The world spun, but he fought through it. Reno sneered. "You always did pick the wrong side, Cole." Wyatt didn't answer. He just lunged. The two men crashed, into the snow like bulls, fists and fury and old ghosts flying. Reno got in 2 solid hits, busting Wyatt's lip and jarring his wounded shoulder. But Wyatt fought like a man with nothing left to lose. He slammed his boot into Reno's knee, twisted free, and drew his knife. It ended fast after that. When Reno fell, bleeding into the snow, the canyon went still. Niall stood nearby, breath heaving, eyes searching. She lowered her rifle and ran to Wyatt, blood on her hands before she even reached him. "You're hit." "Bullet went clean through," he rasped. "Just hurts like hell." She helped him into the saddle, her touch surprisingly gentle. They left the bodies where they fell. There was no time for graves. The real monster wasn't among the dead. Silas Thorne was still out there, and now he'd know they'd fought back. They rode in silence again, but this time, it wasn't born of mistrust. It was something deeper. Wyatt slumped forward slightly in the saddle, hand pressed against the slow bleed from his shoulder. He didn't complain. Men like him didn't see pain as punishment. They saw it as penance. Niall rode ahead, glancing back every few minutes. Her eyes held something different now. Not fear, resolve. They found a shallow cave before nightfall. She started a fire and tended his wound with rough hands and steady breath. Wyatt gritted through it, jaw clenched tight, and watched her in the flickering firelight. There was a strength in her he hadn't seen since Clara May, a fire that didn't burn. It smoldered. "You saved me," he said hoarsely through the ache. She didn't answer, just pressed a damp cloth to his chest and said, "You're not allowed to die. Not yet." He smiled through cracked lips. "Wasn't planning on it." Outside, the wind howled like a wolf mourning the fallen. But inside that cave, something new was born. Blood had been spilled, lines had been crossed, and there was no turning back. They were no longer fugitives. They were a threat, and Silas Thorne would know it soon enough. The fire had burned low by the time Wyatt stirred. The pain in his shoulder was a dull throb now, not sharp like before, but heavy, like an old debt coming due. He sat up slow, boots brushing the scattered ash, and saw Niall seated just beyond the flames, her back straight, rifle across her lap, eyes fixed on the darkness outside. "Couldn't sleep?" he rasped, voice rough as gravel. She didn't turn. "Didn't want to." Wyatt nodded. He understood. In this kind of land, dreams had teeth. And after spilling blood in Dead Man's Gulch, the night didn't offer peace. It whispered names of the dead. The two rode out at first light, Wyatt's movements stiff, his face pale beneath his hat, but his jaw set with that quiet grit he carried like a second skin. Niall had wrapped his shoulder tight and handed him a flask filled with bitter herbs. Apache medicine, she said, though it tasted like fire and regret. They didn't speak much that day. But by sundown, they crested a rise and looked down on a sight that made Wyatt's stomach drop. Smoke. Thick, black, and rising from the valley floor. His gut twisted. "That's Burnt Hollow." Niall's eyes hardened. "It was your people?" "It was a town," Wyatt said. Small, kept to itself, mostly women and kids now since the mines dried up. They pushed down the ridge fast. Dusty fought the descent, hooves sliding, but Wyatt urged him on. The closer they came, the clearer the destruction grew. Homes gutted, wagons overturned, livestock scattered or dead. The chapel roof had caved in. The well had been smashed with a hammer. No mercy, just ruin. They found survivors huddled in the cellar of the old post office. A woman with soot in her hair and a gash above her eye said Silas Thorne's men had come looking for Wyatt. When he wasn't there, they took revenge on the town. "I begged them," she said, voice trembling. "Told them you hadn't been seen in weeks, but they just laughed, said they'd leave a message." Wyatt clenched his fists. His knuckles cracked. He looked at the children, 5 of them, huddled behind their mother's skirts, eyes wide with hunger and fear. And in that moment, something in him shifted. The guilt no longer curled inside him like a ghost, it blazed. He stood up, blood-stained shirt hanging loose at the shoulder, and turned to Neil. "They're not going to stop." "No," she said calmly. "They won't. They think this land belongs to them. They think fear keeps it." Neil stepped forward. "Then we show 'em fear ain't enough." That night they buried the dead. Quietly. The way folks do when the world feels broken and the stars feel too far away. Wyatt carved crosses into splintered fence posts. Niall sang softly in Apache, a song not of mourning, but of vengeance. By morning, Wyatt had saddled Dusty again. His shoulder still ached, but he'd strapped the rifle to his back, revolver at his side. Neil handed him a hand-drawn map, outposts, trails, names scratched in charcoal. "Thorne's men move between here and Cutter's Peak," she said. "We can hit their supply line, make 'em bleed." Wyatt looked at her, something fierce rising in his chest. "You ready to become outlaws?" "We're already outlaws," she replied. "Might as well make it count." They rode hard that day, 2 riders against a storm. But they weren't running anymore. They were hunting, and as they disappeared into the canyons, burnt hollow behind, them smoldering in the morning sun, a wind swept through the valley, a whisper carried on it. Wyatt Cole wasn't a ghost. He was coming. The morning broke slow and red, like the sky itself was bleeding for what was coming. Wyatt adjusted the bandage at his shoulder, now stiff from days of riding, fighting, and running, short on mercy. Dusty pawed the ground beneath him, snorting at the scent of war that hung in the air like smoke before a brush fire. Neol crouched beside a boulder, scanning the valley below through a cracked spyglass. Her hair whipped behind her in the wind and her gaze was unshakable, focused like a hawk locked on its prey. "They're posted up at Black Mesa," she said, voice flat and sure. 8 riders, 1 wagon full of rifles and powder. Maybe more hidden in the scrub. Wyatt rubbed the stubble on his jaw. "It's just us." Neil looked up at him, a half-smile playing on her lips. "It's always been just us." They moved like shadows, picking their way down goat trails and through dry creek beds, every step bringing them closer to the fire. The sun beat down hard, and by high noon, sweat slicked their backs and the air smelled of sagebrush and grit. When they reached the edge of the ridge, Wyatt pulled out a small cloth bundle and opened it. Inside were 6 bullets, each one hand-etched with a name. "Thorne's men," he said quietly, pointing at the letters carved into the lead. "They took everything from me, from Burnt Hollow, from the folks who trusted me to keep 'em safe." He handed Niall 2 of the rounds. "One of these has your name on it?" she asked. He shook his head. "Just theirs." At the first crack of gunfire, the men below scrambled like startled coyotes. Wyatt's shot dropped the lookout clean from his perch. Then came the thunder of hooves, the scream of terrified mules, the angry shout of outlaws trying to find cover where there was none. Neol moved like smoke, graceful, silent, deadly. Her arrows found their mark before the second gun could even bark. She fought not for bloodlust but for balance, justice, the Apache way. Wyatt, though, he fought with fury. With the bone-deep ache of a man who'd lost too much and was done losing. By the time the dust settled, 5 of Thorne's men lay sprawled in the dirt. The rest had fled, cowards to the end. 1 wagon burned slow behind them, the fire licking. At the crates of stolen ammunition, Wyatt limped toward the bodies, kneeling beside one. A young man no older than 20, eyes still open, hand outstretched like he was reaching for home. He didn't even know why he was here, Wyatt muttered. Niall stood over him. "Thorne doesn't recruit men, he poisons them." Wyatt rose to his feet, his jaw clenched so tight it popped. "Then we cut off the snake's head." That night, they camped beneath the stars in silence. No fire, no words, just the sound of the wind whispering through the canyon walls. But sleep didn't come easy. Wyatt's mind spun with memories, of Mary's laughter, of his boy's first steps, of the smell of gunpowder and the cry of a town burning because he wasn't there to stop it. He thought of what Niall had lost too. Her tribe scattered, her blood hunted like animals, her way of life treated like it was worth less than cattle. They were both ghosts in their own land. But tomorrow they would ride into Dustwell, where Silas Thorne held court like a king behind saloon walls and armed guards. Tomorrow justice would speak loud and it wouldn't need a gavel. Wyatt leaned back against the rock staring at the moon. "Niall," he said softly. She didn't open her eyes. You ever wonder if we're going to survive this?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I don't wonder. I know we won't survive if we don't finish it." Wyatt smiled faintly. There it was, that fire, that unyielding fire that burned brighter than any flame. He looked down at the last bullet in his palm, etched into it, Thorne. Dustwell never felt more still than the moment Wyatt Tanner rode back in. The town was quiet, like it had drawn in one long breath and forgotten how to let it out. Storefronts shuttered, church bell frozen in silence. Folks peered from behind curtains, knowing a storm had come home wearing spurs and a stare that could cut glass. Beside him rode Niall, her expression carved from stone. She carried no fear in her eyes, just purpose, just memory. They dismounted near the saloon where the law used to mean something and now just meant Thorne's ledger got paid on time. Wyatt stepped through the batwing doors like a man walking into his own grave. Inside, the air was stale with whiskey and gun oil. Silas Thorne stood behind the bar like a king holding court, flanked by hired guns with twitchy hands and hollow eyes. "Well, I'll be damned," Thorne drawled, that smug grin splitting his bearded face. "Look what the wind coughed up." Wyatt didn't answer. He just walked, slow, controlled, the kind of calm that made even devils flinch. "I ain't here to talk," Wyatt finally said. "I'm here to end what should have ended a long time." "Go," Thorne laughed. "You think you're some hero now? After abandoning your post? After letting Burnt Hollow burn while you played rancher?" Wyatt's voice dropped. "You set that fire. You spilled blood on sacred Apache land. You bought this town with bullets and lies." Silas reached under the bar. Wyatt already had his Colt half raised. One shot cracked loud and final. A bottle shattered behind the bar. A warning. The room exploded. Gunfire screamed. Wood splintered. Men died quick and ugly. Niall moved like the wind, her blade dancing through the chaos. Wyatt kept his back to hers. Every bullet a promise paid in full. The smoke swirled like ghosts circling the living. When the last echo faded, only Thorne remained, bleeding, crawling, begging. Wyatt stood over him, gun still warm. "You remember Mary's eyes, Silas?" he said low. "You looked her in the face before you lit that match." Thorne spat blood. "This land was never yours." Wyatt pulled the trigger, not for revenge, for justice, for Mary, for the son he buried with his own calloused hands. He holstered the Colt and turned to Niall. "It's done." But she shook her head. "No. Now it begins." Later that evening, townsfolk trickled from their hiding places. Families embraced. A little girl offered Wyatt a crust of bread with shaking hands. He knelt and took it gently, as if it were gold. Niall stood on the church steps and spoke in both Apache and English. She spoke of peace, of reckoning, of rebuilding what had been lost. And for the first time in a long while, the people listened. Wyatt didn't stay. He rode out before dawn, a lone figure against the amber light. Some say he headed north. Others swear he returned to Burnt Hollow to plant a new tree where his son had been buried. But most folks agree on one thing. The man who walked into Dustwell that day wasn't just a lawman or a rancher or a ghost from the past. He was hope, wearing boots covered in blood and dust. What would you have done in Wyatt's place? Would you have pulled the trigger or walked away? If this story moved you, don't ride off just yet. Subscribe now for more Western tales of grit, redemption, and the kind of courage we don't see enough of anymore. Let the fire keep burning, partner. The frontier ain't done with us yet.